They say blood is thicker than water, but what they don't tell you is that sometimes blood can drown you. I'm Eleanor. I'm 69 years old, and I'm about to show you what happens when a mother finally stops being the family ATM and starts being a woman who demands respect. It was December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, and I was standing in my kitchen doing what I'd done for 43 years, baking a fruitcake that nobody wanted anymore. My hands moved on autopilot, measuring the candied cherries and rum-soaked raisins, while Whiskers, my orange tabby cat, wound between my legs hoping for scraps. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that settles into your bones when you realize you're completely alone in a world that's supposed to be filled with family during the holidays. My phone sat on the counter, its screen dark and silent, mocking me with its lack of notifications. No calls. No texts. Just me, Whiskers, and a fruitcake nobody would eat. I wiped my flour-covered hands on my apron and picked up my phone, scrolling mindlessly through social media the way lonely people do when they're searching for connection in all the wrong places. That's when I saw it. The post that would change everything. My daughter-in-law Sarah's Instagram story, a photo of a luxury cabin covered in pristine snow, Christmas lights twinkling against dark wood, smoke curling from a stone chimney into a perfect winter sky. The caption read, "Family Christmas Retreat." So blessed, with a snowflake emoji and a Christmas tree emoji, because apparently, betrayal needs decorative punctuation. My thumb froze over the screen. I stared at that photo like it was written in a language I didn't understand, even though the message was crystal clear. I zoomed in, my heart hammering against my ribcage, and there in the background, barely visible through the cabin window, was my son David. He was laughing, his head thrown back in that carefree way he used to laugh when he was a little boy and I'd push him on the backyard swing. Next to him was his brother James, my other son, with his arm around his wife Linda. All of them. Together. Without me. The fruitcake batter blurred in front of me as my mind replayed the phone conversation I'd had with David just 4 days earlier. "Mom, I'm so sorry, but I have to work through Christmas. The pharmacy is short-staffed and they need me to cover shifts. You know how it is during the holidays." His voice had sounded so sincere, so apologetic. I'd believed him. Of course I'd believed him. Why wouldn't a mother believe her own son? And James had called the day after with his own excuse, equally convincing, equally false. "Mom, my company has this emergency project and I have to stay on call through the holiday week. I feel terrible about it. We'll definitely visit in January, I promise." January. Always January. The month of broken promises and convenient forgetfulness. But there was no emergency project. No short-staffed pharmacy. Just a luxury cabin that probably cost $3,000 for the week, nestled somewhere in the mountains where mothers apparently weren't welcome. I set my phone down carefully, like it was made of glass that might shatter and cut me, and returned to my fruitcake. What else was I supposed to do? Scream? Cry? Call them and demand an explanation? I'd spent too many years being the peacekeeper, the understanding one, the mother who never made waves. But something was shifting inside me, a tectonic plate of resentment that had been building pressure for years, and I could feel the earthquake coming. Christmas Day arrived the way it always does, indifferent to whether you're surrounded by family or sitting alone in a house that's too big and too quiet. I woke up at 6 in the morning out of habit, even though I had nowhere to be and no one to cook for. The Christmas tree I'd decorated by myself 2 weeks earlier blinked its multicolored lights in the corner of my living room. A sad reminder of Christmases past when my late husband Robert was alive and our home was filled with noise and laughter and the chaos of small children tearing through wrapping paper. Now the presents under the tree were for my sons and grandchildren, carefully wrapped and labeled, waiting for a visit that wasn't coming. I made coffee and sat in Robert's old recliner, the one I still couldn't bring myself to get rid of even though he'd been gone for 7 years. Whiskers jumped into my lap, purring, and I stroked his soft fur while staring at the silent Christmas tree. My phone sat on the side table, face up, screen dark. No calls. No Merry Christmas texts. Not even a generic holiday message. It was like I'd ceased to exist the moment my sons had driven away to their mountain retreat. I pulled out the old photo albums from the bookshelf, the ones with cracked leather covers and yellowing pages, and flipped through memories of better times. David at age 5, missing his front teeth, holding up a toy truck on Christmas morning. James at 7, wearing the Batman costume I'd sewn by hand because we couldn't afford the store-bought version. Both of them as teenagers, rolling their eyes at my insistence on matching Christmas sweaters, but wearing them anyway because back then, they still cared about making me happy. When did it change? When did I become the obligation instead of the center? I couldn't pinpoint the exact moment, but it had been gradual, like erosion. First it was missing Sunday dinners because of work. Then it was forgetting my birthday. Then it was only calling when they needed something, usually money. And I'd given it every single time, because that's what mothers do, right? We give and give and give until there's nothing left but the hollow echo of our own generosity. For lunch, I heated up a frozen turkey dinner in the microwave, the kind that comes in a black plastic tray with compartments for stuffing and mashed potatoes that taste like salted cardboard. I ate it at my dining room table, the same table where I'd hosted 34 Christmas dinners over the years, and I tried not to think about the gourmet meal my sons were probably enjoying at that cabin. I fed Whiskers his premium cat food, the expensive kind I bought because at least someone in this house deserved to be spoiled, and I whispered to him, "At least you're honest about only wanting me for food. You don't pretend to love me and then abandon me." Whiskers meowed and rubbed against my leg, and I decided right then that cats were far superior to children. As evening fell and the winter sun disappeared behind the trees in my backyard, I made the mistake of checking Instagram again. Why do we do this to ourselves? Why do we scroll through the highlight reels of other people's lives, knowing it will only make us feel worse? But I couldn't help it. I needed to see. I needed to understand the shape of my exclusion. And there they were, more posts, more photos, more evidence of the family Christmas I wasn't invited to. David's wife Sarah had posted a picture of the entire family opening presents around a roaring fireplace, everyone wearing matching red pajamas that I had no idea existed. James had shared a video of my grandchildren building a snowman, their laughter echoing through my phone speaker like a knife twisting in my chest. And the caption on Sarah's post, the one that made my hands shake with rage, read, "Best Christmas ever." Sometimes you just need to get away from everything. Get away from everything. From everyone. From me. I was the everything they needed to escape. The burden. The obligation. The mother who had devoted 43 years to raising them, sacrificing my own dreams and desires so they could have opportunities one never had, and this was my reward. A frozen dinner and a cat on Christmas Day while they made memories without me. But here's the thing about rage. When it's hot and fresh, you make stupid decisions. You call people screaming. You send angry texts you'll regret. You burn bridges in a blaze of righteous fury that feels good in the moment, but leaves you with nothing but ashes and apologies. I'd watched enough drama in my 69 years to know that revenge served hot is messy and unsatisfying. So instead of picking up my phone to call and yell and cry and beg for an explanation, I did something different. I sat in that rage and let it cool. I let it crystallize into something sharp and clear and purposeful. I opened my laptop. The next morning, December 26th, while my sons were probably sleeping off their Christmas hangovers in their luxury cabin, I was wide awake at my kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and my financial records spread out in front of me. Bank statements, canceled checks, printed emails, text message screenshots. I'd kept everything, not because I was planning for this moment, but because I was organized by nature, a habit from my 40 years working as a legal secretary before I retired. And as I reviewed the documents, a pattern emerged that I'd been too blind or too willing to ignore for years. A loan to David for his can't-miss business opportunity that missed spectacularly $15,000, given 3 years ago, never mentioned again, certainly never repaid. Money for James's daughter's private school tuition because public school just wasn't rigorous enough. $22,000 over 2 years, paid directly to the school because James said they were having temporary cash flow issues. That apparently became permanent. The down payments I'd gifted both sons for their houses, $30,000 each, withdrawn from the retirement account Robert and I had built together through decades of careful saving. Car repairs. Medical bills. Emergency vet bills for dogs that they later rehomed when the animals became inconvenient. It all added up. Every canceled check, every bank transfer, every time I'd said yes when I should have said no. $127,000. That's what my sons had cost me over the years, and I had the documentation to prove it. But here's what made my blood run cold. It wasn't just the money. Money is just paper and numbers. What broke something inside me was realizing that every single one of those loans had come with a story, a justification, a promise. Mom, I'll pay you back as soon as the business takes off. Mom, this is just temporary. We'll reimburse you next tax season. Mom, you know we're good for it. Lies. All lies. Or maybe not even lies. Maybe just convenient truths they told themselves so they didn't have to feel guilty about treating me like their personal bank. And I'd enabled it every single time because I wanted to be the good mother, the supportive mother, the mother who never said no. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I'd had saved for 15 years, but rarely used. Richard Chin Law Office, the receptionist answered. Richard had handled Robert's estate when he died, and he'd done my will 5 years ago, a simple document that left everything split 50-50 between my two sons, because that's what mothers are supposed to do, right? Divide everything equally, even when the love and effort aren't reciprocated equally. Hi, this is Eleanor Martinez. I need to schedule an appointment with Richard as soon as possible. I need to update my will. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Is everything all right, Mrs. Martinez? The receptionist asked with that careful concern people use when they think you might be dying. Everything's fine, I said, and I realized as I said it that it was true. For the first time in years, everything was actually fine because I was finally taking control. I just need to make some changes. Can he see me this week? After I hung up with Richard's office, I made one more call. Pine Valley Animal Shelter. This is Martha speaking. Martha's voice was warm and familiar. I'd been volunteering at the shelter twice a week for the past 3 years, ever since I'd retired and needed something to fill my days besides waiting for phone calls from sons who rarely called. Martha, it's Eleanor. I know you're probably busy with holiday adoptions, but do you have time this week to discuss a potential major donation? I could hear the surprise in Martha's voice when she responded. Eleanor, of course. Is everything okay? Why did everyone keep asking me that? Was it so shocking that I might want to do something for myself, something that didn't revolve around being the ever-giving mother? Everything's perfect, I said. I've just been doing some thinking about my legacy, and I'd like to discuss how I might be able to help expand the shelter. Maybe build that new medical wing you've been dreaming about. The rest of that week was a blur of activity, but the focused kind, the purposeful kind, the kind that comes when you've finally decided to stop being a victim of your own generosity. On December 27th, I met with Richard at his office downtown, a wood-paneled room filled with law books and the smell of old paper and leather. I brought my accordion file stuffed with financial documents, and I spread them across his mahogany desk like evidence at a trial. Richard, I need your honest legal opinion. If I gave money to my sons and documented it as loans, not gifts, do I have the right to request repayment? Richard adjusted his glasses and began reviewing the documents, his face carefully neutral in that way lawyers have perfected. After 20 minutes of silence broken only by the rustling of paper, he looked up at me with something like respect in his eyes. Eleanor, these are ironclad. You have signed loan agreements, witnessed and dated, for the major amounts. For the smaller amounts, you have text messages where your sons explicitly acknowledge the money as loans with promises to repay. You have every legal right to request full repayment, and if they refuse, you could take them to small claims court or file for civil collection. I felt something settle in my chest, something solid and unshakable. Validation. I want to send them formal repayment request letters, I said. Itemized. Dated. With payment terms. Richard nodded slowly. I can draft those for you. But Eleanor, can I ask, what's prompting this? Is there a reason you're calling in these debts now? I could have told him everything. About the Instagram posts and the luxury cabin and spending Christmas alone with a frozen dinner. About 43 years of motherhood that had apparently earned me nothing but exclusion and lies. But all I said was, let's just say I've decided to start treating my sons the way they treat me, like business associates rather than family. Richard didn't ask any more questions. He just nodded and started typing. The new will was drafted on December 28th. It was surprisingly simple, really, just a few pages that would change everything. The bulk of my estate, my house, worth $450,000 after I'd paid off the mortgage with Robert's life insurance money, my savings of $180,000, and the investment accounts Robert had left me that had grown to just over $200,000, would go to the Pine Valley Animal Shelter for the express purpose of building and maintaining the Eleanor Martinez Memorial Medical Wing. My sons would each receive $5,000 for memory's sake, a phrase Richard suggested that sounded appropriately ironic. I signed it in Richard's office with his secretary and paralegal as witnesses, and then we had it notarized. It was official. Legal. Unchangeable unless I chose to change it. That afternoon, I drove to the animal shelter with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. The shelter was chaos, as always, dogs barking in the kennels, cats meowing from their cages, the smell of disinfectant and animal fur thick in the air. But it was honest chaos, authentic chaos, the chaos of living things that didn't pretend to be something they weren't. Martha met me in her cramped office, surrounded by adoption paperwork and donation receipts, her gray hair pulled back in a messy bun and her eyes tired but kind. Eleanor, you mentioned a donation? I pulled out my phone and showed her the architectural plans I'd found online for a state-of-the-art veterinary facility. What if I told you I wanted to fund something like this? A full medical wing with surgical suites, recovery rooms, an isolation area for sick animals. What would that mean for the shelter? Martha's eyes filled with tears, and she reached across her desk to grab my hand. Eleanor, that would be transformative. We turn away so many animals because we don't have the medical capacity. We have to euthanize treatable conditions because we can't afford the surgeries. A facility like this would let us save 3, maybe 4 times as many animals. But something like this would cost. I know what it would cost, I interrupted gently. And I'm prepared to fund it. Not now, but through my estate. I've updated my will. When I die, this shelter will receive the majority of my assets, earmarked specifically for building and maintaining this facility. Martha was crying openly now, and she came around the desk to hug me. Eleanor, I don't know what to say. This is incredibly generous. I hugged her back, and for the first time since Christmas, I felt something other than rage and betrayal. I felt purpose. I've spent my whole life investing in people who saw me as an ATM. I'd like to spend whatever time I have left investing in creatures who actually appreciate loyalty. For the next few days, I moved through my house like a ghost, but a purposeful ghost, one with unfinished business. I took down the family photos that had lined my hallway for decades, the portraits of my sons at various ages, the wedding photos, the grandchildren's school pictures. I didn't throw them away. I wasn't cruel. I just packed them carefully in boxes and stored them in the basement, out of sight. In their place, I hung photos from my volunteer work at the shelter, pictures of me with dogs I'd helped rehabilitate, cats I'd socialized, the faces of animals whose lives had meaning. I rearranged my living room, moving Robert's chair to face the window instead of the television, and I realized I was creating a home for one person, not a shrine to a family that no longer existed. On New Year's Eve morning, I composed a text message to both my sons in a group chat. My fingers hesitated over the keyboard for just a moment before I typed, New Year's Day brunch at my house, 11 a.m. Important family announcement. Be there. I watched the three dots appear almost immediately as David started typing. Mom, we haven't heard from you. Is everything okay? We can definitely make it. Then James, everything all right? We'll be there. Do you need us to bring anything? I smiled at their sudden concern, their panic barely disguised as politeness. Just yourselves, I typed back. See you tomorrow. I didn't add a smiley face emoji or a heart or any of the digital affection I usually included in messages to my sons. Just cold, simple words. They could interpret them however they wanted. I spent the rest of New Year's Eve preparing for the confrontation I'd been planning all week. I baked my famous cinnamon rolls, the ones my sons had been begging me to make since they were children, the recipe I'd perfected over 40 years of Christmas mornings and birthday breakfasts. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was baiting the trap with their favorite food. I set my dining room table with my good china, the set my mother had given me when Robert and I got married, plates we only used for special occasions. This was definitely a special occasion. I created a slideshow on my laptop, carefully selecting photos and arranging them in the order that would tell my story most effectively, building to the reveal that would shatter their comfortable illusions. And finally, I printed out the loan repayment letters Richard had drafted, placed them in crisp manila envelopes with each son's name written in my careful handwriting, and set them on the sideboard next to the framed copy of my new will that I had made at the print shop. Everything was ready. The stage was set. And as I went to bed that night with Whiskers curled up beside me, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: anticipation. Not dread, not anxiety, not the exhausting emotional labor of trying to keep everyone happy. Just clean, sharp anticipation. Tomorrow, my sons would learn that the mother they'd taken for granted, the ATM they'd been withdrawing from for years without making deposits, had finally closed for business. Tomorrow, they would understand that love without respect is worthless, that family without honesty is fiction, and that every choice has consequences, even the choice to exclude your mother from Christmas while lying about why. New Year's Day morning arrived with the kind of clarity that only comes after you've burned down your old life and are waiting to see what rises from the ashes. I was up at 5 a.m., not because I was nervous, but because I was ready. I'd spent a week planning this confrontation with the precision of a military operation, and now it was time to execute. The cinnamon rolls were warming in the oven, filling my house with the scent of butter and sugar and childhood memories that my sons had apparently forgotten. The dining table was set with my mother's china, each plate positioned exactly, each fork and knife aligned like weapons waiting to be deployed. And in my laptop, queued up and ready to play, was the slideshow that would expose every lie they'd told me, every time they'd chosen convenience over honesty, luxury over loyalty. I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror as I carried the coffee pot to the dining room, and I barely recognized myself. Not because I looked different physically. I was still the same 69-year-old woman with silver hair and laugh lines around my eyes, but because something fundamental had shifted in my expression. I looked dangerous. Not in the obvious way, not with anger or rage distorting my features, but with the quiet, calculated danger of someone who has finally stopped playing by rules that only benefit everyone else. Whiskers wound between my legs, sensing the energy in the house, and I bent down to scratch behind his ears. Today, everything changes, I whispered to him. Today, they learn that I'm not just their mother. I'm a woman who demands respect. At exactly 10:45, I heard the first car pull into my driveway. My heart rate didn't increase. My hands didn't shake. I simply walked to the window and watched as David's silver SUV parked behind my old sedan, and I saw him turn to say something to his wife Sarah in the passenger seat. Even from this distance, I could see the tension in their body language, the way Sarah's arms were crossed defensively, the way David's jaw was set. They knew something was wrong. Good. Let them wonder. Let them spend these last few minutes of ignorance trying to guess what was coming, never imagining that their comfortable world was about to collapse around them. 5 minutes later, James's black truck pulled in beside David's SUV, and my entire family emerged from their vehicles like actors taking the stage, except they didn't know what play they were performing or that I'd written the script. The grandchildren tumbled out, bundled in winter coats, chattering excitedly because Grandma's house meant treats and attention and the kind of unconditional love I'd always given freely. Too freely, it turned out. David's daughter Emma, my oldest grandchild at 14, was already on her phone, probably posting something to whatever social media platform teenagers use these days. James's son Tyler, 11 years old and full of energy, ran ahead toward my front door. And behind them came the adults, moving slowly, reluctantly, like prisoners walking to their sentencing. I opened the door before they could knock, and I smiled. Not a warm smile, not the grandmother smile I usually wore, but something polite and distant, the smile you'd give to acquaintances you're not particularly happy to see. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. "I've been waiting for you." David leaned in to kiss my cheek, a habit from childhood, but I turned my head slightly so his lips met air instead of skin. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable, but I saw him register it, saw the flash of confusion in his eyes. Sarah mumbled a hello without making eye contact. James hugged me, or tried to, but I kept my arms at my sides, and he ended up essentially hugging himself around my rigid body. Linda, James's wife, looked around my house with barely concealed criticism, taking in the empty walls where family photos used to hang. "You've redecorated," she said, and it sounded like an accusation. "I've decluttered," I corrected. "Got rid of things that were taking up space without adding any value." The children scattered immediately, heading for the living room where I used to keep a toy box that I'd quietly donated to the animal shelter last week. They'd find nothing there now except furniture and Whiskers, who would probably hiss at them because, unlike me, my cat had never learned to hide his true feelings. "Let's eat," I said, gesturing to the dining room. I made cinnamon rolls. I watched as my sons' faces lit up with that particular joy that comes from nostalgia, from the memory of every birthday and holiday morning when they'd woken up to the smell of these rolls. They had no idea they were eating their last supper. We sat around the table in assigned seats that I'd mentally planned, me at the head, where Robert used to sit, with David and Sarah on one side, James and Linda on the other, and the children scattered at the far end where they could be seen but not heard. The conversation was painfully artificial, everyone making small talk about the weather and the traffic and anything except the elephant in the room, which was why I'd summoned them here with such ominous finality. David complimented the cinnamon rolls 3 times, as if excessive praise could paper over the weeks of silence and lies. Sarah asked about Whiskers, pretending she cared about the cat she'd once called that mangy thing when she thought I wasn't listening. James talked about work with the desperate energy of someone filling silence to avoid dealing with tension. And Linda said nothing, just picked at her food and checked her phone under the table. I let them eat. I let them talk. I let them think that maybe, just maybe, this was simply a nice family brunch and they'd been worried for nothing. And then, when everyone had finished their rolls and the children were getting restless, I stood up and walked to the living room where my laptop was already connected to the television. "Before everyone leaves," I said, my voice cutting through the nervous chatter, "I made a little presentation about my year. Just a slideshow. Humor an old woman." I saw David and James exchange glances, probably thinking this was some sentimental photo montage they'd have to sit through while making appropriate appreciative noises. They had no idea what was coming. The slideshow began innocuously enough, photos of me at my book club, smiling with my friend Dorothy over coffee and paperbacks. Me at the animal shelter, holding a puppy that had been abandoned in a box by the highway. Me at my volunteer shift at the food bank, ladling soup into bowls for people whose society had forgotten. "I've had a busy year," I narrated, my voice pleasant and conversational. "Lots of activities. Lots of new friends. Lots of time to reflect on what really matters in life." The next few slides showed more of the same, me living my life, a life that clearly didn't include my sons or their families, and I could feel the discomfort building in the room. Why wasn't I showing photos of them? Why weren't their children featured in their grandmother's year in review? And then the tone shifted. The next slide was a photo of my Christmas tree, lit up and beautiful, with presents underneath wrapped in paper that would never be opened because the recipients never came. The slide after that showed my dining room table, set for one, with a frozen dinner on my good china. This was my Christmas, I said, and my voice had lost its pleasant tone, replaced by something harder, something sharp enough to cut. December 25th. Me, whiskers, and a turkey dinner that cost $3.99 at the grocery store. The room went silent. Even the children stopped fidgeting. Sarah's face had gone pale. David was staring at the screen like he couldn't quite process what he was seeing. But I wasn't done. The next slide appeared, and it was a screenshot of Sarah's Instagram post, that photo of the luxury cabin with its perfect snow and twinkling lights and the caption about being blessed and getting away from everything. I'd placed it side by side with my photo of the frozen dinner, a split screen of two very different Christmases. Interesting, isn't it? I continued, my voice calm, almost clinical. On one side, we have a family retreat at what I can only assume was an expensive mountain cabin. And on the other side, we have a frozen dinner in a microwave. Same day, same family. Very different experiences. I let that sink in for a moment, let them sit in the uncomfortable truth of what they'd done, and then I advanced to the next slide. What followed was a methodical documentation of their lies. Screenshots of text messages where David claimed he had to work through Christmas, time-stamped and dated. Next to those, Instagram posts showing him clearly not at work but at a cabin opening champagne. Screenshots of James's email about his emergency work project that required him to stay on call, followed by photos of him building a snowman with his children in what was obviously not his backyard. I'd created a timeline of deception, a visual representation of every lie they'd told me, and I watched their faces as they realized I'd kept receipts. Literal receipts. Mom, David started, his voice weak, almost pleading. We can explain. I held up my hand, and the authority in that simple gesture silenced him immediately. Oh, I'm sure you can explain, I said. I'm sure you have excellent explanations for why you told me you were working when you were actually on vacation. I'm sure you have wonderful justifications for why you excluded me from a family Christmas while posting about it publicly on social media. But you know what? I'm not interested in your explanations. Not yet. Because I'm not finished with my presentation. The next slide appeared, and this one brought audible gasps from around the room. It was a photo of me at the animal shelter, standing next to Martha, and between us was a large architectural rendering on a display board. The rendering showed a beautiful modern building with clean lines and large windows, and across the top in bold letters it read, Eleanor Martinez Memorial Medical Wing, Pine Valley Animal Shelter. I let them study it, let them wonder what it meant, and then I spoke. This is what I've been working on this week. This is where I've decided my legacy will live. The shelter needs a state-of-the-art medical facility to save animals that would otherwise be euthanized due to lack of resources. And I'm going to fund it. Not now, obviously, since I'm still alive and plan to stay that way for a good long while. But when I die, this is where my money is going. I clicked to the next slide, and this was the one that made Sarah gasp and Linda actually stand up from her chair. It was a photo of my new will, the official document with Richard's law firm letterhead at the top and my signature at the bottom, and I'd zoomed in on the relevant section so everyone could read it clearly. I, Eleanor Martinez, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath the entirety of my estate, including all property, savings, and investments, to the Pine Valley Animal Shelter for the express purpose of building and maintaining the Eleanor Martinez Memorial Medical Wing. To my sons, David Martinez and James Martinez, I leave the sum of $5,000 each for memory's sake. The date on the document was December 28th, less than a week ago. Less than a week after I'd spent Christmas alone while they lied to my face. The room erupted. David was on his feet, his face flushed red. Mom, what is this? What are you doing? James was shaking his head repeatedly, like if he denied it hard enough, it would stop being true. Sarah had tears streaming down her face, though whether they were tears of guilt or tears of lost inheritance, I couldn't tell. Linda was the only one who looked angry rather than shocked, her jaw set and her eyes blazing. "This is insane," Linda spat. "You can't be serious. We're your family." I turned to look at her, really look at her, and I smiled that cold, distant smile again. "Funny you should mention family, Linda. Because that's exactly what I thought I was when I raised 2 sons for 43 years. When I sacrificed my own dreams so they could have better opportunities. When I gave them every cent I could spare and some I couldn't. I thought I was family. But apparently, family doesn't get invited to Christmas." But I still wasn't finished, and I could see the panic building in their eyes as they realized this train had no brakes and wasn't stopping until it reached its final destination. "Now," I said, returning to my seat at the head of the table with the kind of composure that comes from righteous anger turned into calculated action, "we need to discuss the business side of our relationship. Since we've clearly established that I'm not family enough for Christmas invitations, I think it's time we acknowledge what I actually am to you. I'm a bank, an ATM, a source of funding with no expectation of repayment. Well, I'm closing that bank today." I reached beside my chair where I'd placed 2 manila envelopes, crisp and official looking, and I slid them across the table with the deliberate slowness of someone dealing cards in a poker game where the stakes are everything. 1 envelope to David. 1 envelope to James. "Open them," I instructed. My sons looked at each other, then at their wives, then at me, and I could see they were hoping this was some kind of elaborate joke, some weird test of their love that they could pass with the right words or gestures. It wasn't a joke. It was a reckoning. David opened his envelope first, his hands shaking slightly as he pulled out the document inside. I watched his eyes scan the page, watched his face go from confusion to comprehension to horror as he read the itemized list of every loan I'd given him over the past decade. The $15,000 for his failed business venture. The $8,000 for the car repair that insurance should have covered. The $12,000 for the European vacation he'd called a necessary mental health break. The $30,000 for his house down payment. On and on, line after line. Date after date, all documented with check numbers and bank transfer confirmations. At the bottom, in bold letters, was the total, $67,000. And beneath that, in Richard's precise legal language, payment in full is requested by February 28th. Failure to comply may result in civil collection proceedings. James opened his envelope more slowly, as if delaying the inevitable would somehow change what was inside. His list was slightly different, but equally damning. The $22,000 for his daughter's private school tuition. The $9,000 for the dental work his insurance wouldn't cover. The $7,000 for the roof repair on the house I'd helped him buy. The $30,000 house down payment that matched his brother's. His total, $58,000. Same deadline. Same consequences for non-payment. Both of my sons sat frozen, staring at the documents in their hands like they were written in a foreign language they couldn't quite translate. "These are bills," David finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're billing us? For money you gave us?" "These were gifts, Mom. These were help. Family help." I leaned back in my chair, and I felt a strange calm settle over me, the kind of calm that comes when you finally stopped pretending and started telling the truth. "Read the documentation more carefully, David. Every single one of those transactions was documented as a loan. You signed paperwork. You sent me text messages explicitly calling them loans and promising to repay me when things got better. Things never got better, did they? Or maybe they did, and you just decided that paying back your mother was less important than ski vacations and luxury cabin rentals." James was shaking his head, his face a mixture of disbelief and anger. "Mom, this is $58,000. We don't have this kind of money just lying around. This is insane. You're being vindictive and cruel." And there it was, the accusation I'd been expecting, the one that tried to make me the villain in a story where I was clearly the victim. Vindictive. I repeated, and I let the word hang in the air between us. Vindictive would be calling you on Christmas Day while you were at that cabin and screaming at you for being liars. Vindictive would be posting on social media about how my sons abandoned me on the most family-oriented holiday of the year. Vindictive would be showing up at your workplaces and telling your colleagues what kind of men you really are. This isn't vindictive, James. This is business. You've treated me like a business for years, making withdrawals with no deposits, so now I'm simply calling in the debt. Sarah was crying harder now, and she reached across the table toward me with trembling hands. Eleanor, please, you have to understand. We didn't mean to hurt you. The cabin was Linda's idea. She organized everything, and we just went along with it, and we should have invited you. We know we should have, but we thought you thought what? I interrupted, and my voice had gone cold, so cold that Sarah pulled her hands back like I'd burned her. You thought I wouldn't find out? You thought I was too stupid to use Instagram? Or you thought I'd find out and just accept it because that's what I always do, accept being treated as less than, as an afterthought, as someone whose feelings don't matter as long as everyone else is comfortable. Linda, who'd been silent this entire time, finally spoke up, and her voice was sharp with defiance. You know what? Maybe we didn't invite you because you're exhausting, Eleanor. Maybe we needed a break from the constant guilt trips and the martyrdom and the way you make everything about you. Maybe we just wanted one holiday where we didn't have to perform gratitude for every little thing you've ever done for us. The room went absolutely silent. Even the children, who'd been whispering to each other at the far end of the table, stopped talking. Everyone stared at Linda, shocked that she'd said out loud what they'd probably all been thinking, but were too cowardly to voice. I looked at Linda for a long moment, and then I started laughing. Not hysterical laughter, not angry laughter, but genuine, surprised laughter that bubbled up from somewhere deep in my chest. Thank you, Linda, I said when I finally caught my breath. Thank you for being honest. Because that's what's been missing from this family for years, honesty. You're right. I am exhausting. Do you know what's exhausting? Being a mother who gives everything and receives nothing. Being a grandmother who only sees her grandchildren when it's convenient for everyone else. Being an ATM who's expected to dispense money with a smile and never, ever ask for anything in return. That's exhausting. But you know what's even more exhausting? Pretending that any of this is normal. Pretending that the way you all treat me is acceptable. Pretending that I'm fine when I'm not fine. I stood up from the table, and I walked to the sideboard where I'd placed the framed copy of my will. I picked it up and held it so everyone could see it clearly, this official document that represented my final middle finger to the family dynamic that had drained me dry. Here's the truth that none of you want to hear, I continued. You've been treating me like I'm already dead. Like I'm just this resource to be used up, this checkbook to be rated, this obligation to be managed with minimal effort. Well, if that's how you see me, then I might as well make it official. This will stay exactly as it is. The animal shelter gets my estate. You get $5,000 each and a lifetime of regrets. David was crying now, actual tears streaming down his face, and it was the first time I'd seen him cry since his father's funeral. Mom, please, we made a mistake, a huge mistake, but you can't throw away our entire relationship over one Christmas. We love you. We do. We got caught up in, we should have been better, and we will be better, I promise. Just please don't do this. But his words bounced off me like rain off glass because I'd heard versions of this promise before, after every forgotten birthday, every canceled visit. Every time they disappointed me and then scrambled to smooth things over with the bare minimum of effort required to assuage their guilt. You're right, David, I said softly. This isn't about one Christmas. This is about years of being taken for granted. This is about being loved conditionally, only when it's convenient, only when I'm useful. This is about loans that become gifts the moment it's time to repay them. This is about teaching you both a lesson that I should have taught you decades ago, that I am a person with feelings and dignity and a right to be treated with respect. Not because I gave birth to you, not because I sacrificed for you, but because I'm a human being who deserves basic decency. James stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against my hardwood floor with a sound like a scream. So what? We pay you back and then what? You still leave everything to a bunch of animals? We grovel and apologize and change our behavior, and it doesn't even matter because you've already decided we're not worth your inheritance. I met his eyes, and I saw my younger son, the one I'd rocked to sleep when he had nightmares, the one I'd taught to ride a bike and helped with homework and supported through his divorce and remarriage. But I also saw a man who'd learned to see me as a means to an end, and I wasn't sure which version was the real one. The will and the debt are separate issues, James, I explained with the patience of someone teaching a child basic concepts he should have learned long ago. The debt is about accountability. You borrowed money, you pay it back. That's how the world works for everyone who doesn't have a mother they can exploit. The will is about legacy. It's about who I trust to honor my memory, who I trust to use my resources in ways that align with my values. Right now, today, the animal shelter has earned that trust. You haven't. Can that change? Maybe. But it won't change because you're panicking about losing an inheritance you never earned and never respected. It will only change if you actually become the men I raised you to be instead of the men you've chosen to become. Sarah was still crying, and she looked at her husband with something like accusation in her eyes. This is your fault, she hissed at David. I told you we should have invited her. I told you this was a bad idea. But no, you said she wouldn't care. You said she'd understand. You said, don't you dare put this all on me. David shot back, his grief transforming into anger that needed a target. You're the one who organized the whole trip. You're the one who wanted a family holiday that didn't include my mother. You're the one who posted all those pictures on Instagram like you were rubbing it in her face. And just like that, they were fighting with each other instead of addressing me, which was so typical, so predictable, so exactly why I'd reached this breaking point in the first place. Enough, I said, and the word cut through their argument like a knife through butter. This isn't about blame. There's plenty of that to go around. This is about consequences. You made choices. I'm making choices. You excluded me. I'm excluding you from my estate. You treated our relationship as transactional. I'm treating it as transactional. The only difference is that I'm being honest about it, and apparently, honesty in this family is revolutionary. I walked back to the table and stood there, looking at both of my sons, these men I'd created and raised and loved with every fiber of my being, and I felt a sadness so profound it was almost physical. But beneath the sadness was something else, something harder and cleaner, self-respect. You have until February 28th to pay what you owe, I said. That's 8 weeks. I suggest you start planning. As for the will, it stays as written unless, and until I see genuine, sustained change in how you treat me. Not performative change. Not temporary change designed to manipulate me into giving you what you want. Real change. The kind that lasts. The kind that means you value me as a person, not as a resource. Linda stood up, her face twisted with rage. You're blackmailing your own children, she accused. You're holding money over their heads to force them to pretend to love you. That's sick, Eleanor. That's actually sick. I turned to her with a smile that had no warmth in it whatsoever. No, Linda, I'm teaching them something their father, and I apparently failed to teach them, that actions have consequences. That treating people poorly eventually catches up with you. That you can't take and take and take forever without eventually being asked to give something back. If wanting to be treated with basic respect is blackmail, then yes, I'm blackmailing them. But I prefer to call it setting boundaries for the first time in my life. The children were staring at all of us now, confused and frightened by the adult drama unfolding before them. Emma, the 14-year-old, spoke up for the first time. Grandma, are you saying you don't love us anymore? And my heart broke a little because she was innocent in all this. They all were. These children who'd been taught by their parents that Grandma was always available, always giving, always there whenever needed, but never important enough to include in the important moments. I walked over to Emma and knelt down in front of her, ignoring the protests from my 69-year-old niece. Sweetheart, I love you more than you can possibly imagine. This isn't about you. This is about your parents learning to be better people. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone you love is let them experience the consequences of their choices. Your dad and uncle made choices that hurt me very badly, and now they need to make it right. Do you understand? Emma nodded slowly, and I saw something in her eyes that looked like respect, maybe even understanding. She was old enough to recognize that her grandmother had been wronged, even if the adults around her were still busy making excuses. I stood up, my knees creaking, and addressed the room one final time. This brunch is over. You know what I expect. You know what you owe. You know what you need to do if you want any kind of relationship with me going forward. The ball, as they say, is in your court. I walked to my front door and opened it, the cold January air rushing in, and I stood there waiting for them to leave. David tried one more time, grabbing my arm as he passed. Mom, please, we can fix this. Just talk to us. Give us a chance. I gently but firmly removed his hand from my arm. I've given you 43 years of chances, David. I've talked until I'm blue in the face. Now it's time for action, not words. February 28th. Or I call Richard and we proceed with collection. They filed out slowly, reluctantly, still processing what had just happened, still trying to understand how their comfortable narrative of the endlessly giving mother had just been incinerated before their eyes. The grandchildren left confused. The daughters-in-law left angry. And my sons left broken, which was exactly how I'd felt on Christmas Day when I'd seen those Instagram posts and realized my own children had looked me in the eye and lied. I closed the door behind them and locked it, and then I walked back to my dining room where the remnants of our brunch still sat on my mother's good china. Whiskers appeared from wherever he'd been hiding from the chaos, and he jumped onto the table to investigate the leftover cinnamon rolls. I didn't stop him. Well, I said to my cat, I guess we'll see if they're capable of change. Or if they're just capable of pretending to change until they get what they want. Whiskers meowed and rubbed against my hand, offering the kind of unconditional affection that humans seemed incapable of providing without strings attached. As I cleared the table and washed the dishes, I thought about the next 8 weeks and what they would reveal about my son's true character. Would they pay me back? Would they try to rebuild our relationship? Or would they lawyer up and try to fight me, try to prove I was senile or manipulated, try to find some legal loophole that would let them keep their inheritance without having to do the hard work of actually earning it back? I didn't know the answer, but for the first time in years, I didn't care what the answer was because either way, I'd already won. I'd won back my self-respect. I'd won back my agency. I'd won back the right to be treated as a person of value instead of a resource to be exploited. And whether my sons could rise to the challenge I'd set before them or whether they'd fail spectacularly, I would be fine because I'd finally learned the most important lesson of all, that loving yourself enough to demand better is not selfish, it's survival. The thing about setting boundaries is that you never really know if they'll hold until someone tests them. And my sons? They were about to test everything. The question wasn't whether they'd try to make things right, the question was whether they'd do it because they actually understood what they'd done wrong, or simply because they wanted their inheritance back. Can people really change when their motivations are corrupt from the start? I was about to find out and, honestly, I wasn't sure which answer I was hoping for. The first week after New Year's Day passed in complete silence. No calls. No texts. No angry emails or tearful voicemails. Nothing. It was the kind of silence that comes after an explosion, when everyone's still checking themselves for injuries and trying to figure out what just happened. I went about my life as normal, volunteering at the animal shelter on Tuesday and Thursday, attending my book club on Wednesday evening, having coffee with Dorothy on Friday morning. Dorothy, bless her heart, had been my friend for 32 years, and she knew something was wrong the moment she saw me. You look different, she said, stirring sugar into her coffee while studying my face with the intensity of someone reading a particularly interesting novel. Not bad different. Just different. What happened? I told her everything. The Christmas exclusion, the Instagram posts, the New Year's Day confrontation, the will, the debt collection. I laid it all out like evidence at a trial, and when I finished, Dorothy sat back in her chair and looked at me with something that might have been awe. "Eleanor Martinez," she said slowly, "I have known you for 3 decades, and this is the first time I've ever seen you put yourself first. I'm proud of you. Genuinely proud. But I have to ask, do you think they'll actually pay you back? That's over $100,000 combined." I sipped my coffee and considered the question. "I don't know if they'll pay me back, Dorothy. But that's almost beside the point. The money was never really about the money. It was about making them face what they've been doing to me for years. It was about forcing them to see me as a person, not a resource. Whether they can actually do that, time will tell." But time, as it turned out, didn't make me wait very long for an answer. On January 9th, 8 days after the confrontation, my doorbell rang at 7 in the evening. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment I considered not answering, but Whiskers was already at the door meowing his head off because he had no concept of strategic avoidance. I looked through the peephole and saw David standing on my porch, alone, his shoulders hunched against the January cold, his breath making little clouds in the frigid air. He looked terrible. His eyes were red-rimmed and puffy, his normally neat hair was disheveled, and he was wearing the ratty old sweatshirt he usually reserved for yard work. This wasn't the polished, put-together son who'd walked into my house for New Year's brunch. This was a man who'd been stripped down to his essential self, and that essential self was hurting. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. I just stood there in my doorway, waiting, making him take the first step because I was done carrying the emotional labor for this relationship. "Mom," he said, and his voice cracked on the word like he was 14 again instead of 42. "Can we talk? Please?" I studied him for a long moment, and I saw the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, terrified of the lightning. But I also saw the man who'd lied to my face about working through Christmas while he was actually building snowmen at a luxury cabin. Which version was standing on my porch right now? "You can come in," I finally said, stepping aside. "But I'm not promising anything except that I'll listen." That's all you get from me right now, the courtesy of listening. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd fed him thousands of meals over the years, and I made tea because that's what you do when someone's hurting, even when that someone has hurt you. I didn't ask him how he took his tea because I already knew, 1 sugar, no milk, the same way he'd been drinking it since he was 12 years old. Some things you don't forget, even when you wish you could. David wrapped his hands around the mug like he was trying to absorb its warmth, and he stared into the tea for a long time before he finally spoke. "I've been a terrible son," he said quietly. "Not just with the Christmas thing. Not just with the money. For years, Mom. Years of taking you for granted, of treating you like you'd always be there no matter how badly I behaved, of prioritizing everyone else over you." I sipped my tea and said nothing because I'd learned that silence is sometimes the most powerful response you can give. It forces the other person to fill the void, to keep talking, to reveal more than they intended. And David filled that silence with confession. "Sarah thought you were judging her parenting," he continued, his words coming faster now, like he'd been holding them in, and they were finally breaking free. "Every time you'd visit, she'd find something you said and interpret it as criticism. The way you'd comment on what the kids were eating or suggest activities they might enjoy or mention how we used to do things when I was growing up. She felt like you were implying she wasn't good enough, and I let her convince me that keeping distance was easier than dealing with the conflict." He looked up at me then, meeting my eyes for the first time since he'd arrived. "But it wasn't really about Sarah, was it? It was about me being a coward. I chose the path of least resistance. I chose my wife over my mother, but I did it in the worst possible way. I didn't talk to you about Sarah's feelings. I didn't try to mediate or explain or work things out. I just slowly cut you out of our lives while telling myself I was keeping the peace. The cabin was Sarah's idea. She wanted a couple's trip with James and Linda, but I said yes. I agreed to lie to you. I looked you in the eye and told you I had to work, knowing you'd spend Christmas alone, and I told myself you wouldn't mind, you'd understand, you'd be fine because you're always fine. The tears came then, sliding down his face in steady streams that he didn't bother to wipe away. But you weren't fine. And I knew you wouldn't be fine. I just didn't want to deal with it. I wanted the fun trip and the Instagram photos and the freedom of a holiday without obligations. And the worst part? When I was at that cabin, having the time of my life, there were moments when I thought about you. Brief flashes where I wondered what you were doing, if you were okay. And I pushed those thoughts away because acknowledging them would have meant acknowledging what a piece of garbage I was being. So I laughed louder and drank more wine and took more pictures and pretended everything was perfect. I set my tea down carefully, and I took a breath before responding because this was the moment that mattered, this conversation that could either begin to repair what was broken or shatter it beyond recognition. Do you know what hurt the most, David? I asked, and my voice was steady even though my heart was racing. It wasn't that you went on a trip without me. I'm not so pathetic that I need to be included in every family gathering. It was the lying. You could have said, Mom, Sarah wants to do a couple's trip, and I think it would be good for our marriages. I would have been disappointed, maybe a little hurt, but I would have understood. Instead, you lied. You treated me like I was stupid enough to believe your excuses. You robbed me of the dignity of knowing the truth and choosing how to respond to it. David nodded, and more tears fell. You're right. The lying was worse than the exclusion. And it wasn't just that one lie, was it? It's been years of small lies and half-truths and convenient omissions. Telling you we'd visit, and then canceling at the last minute. Saying we were too broke to pay you back while booking expensive vacations. Acting like we cared about your life while really just waiting for our turn to talk about ours. I see it now, Mom. I see all of it. And I hate myself for it. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket and slid it across the table. This is a payment plan I worked out. I can't give you $67,000 by February 28th. I don't have it. But I can start paying you back in monthly installments, and I've listed every asset I own that I can sell to accelerate the timeline. My boat. Sarah's jewelry. The expensive golf clubs. We're cutting every luxury expense, and I've taken on extra consulting work. This isn't me trying to negotiate. This is me showing you I'm serious about making this right. I picked up the paper and read through it. He'd calculated everything down to the penny, monthly payments of $2,000, combined with lump sums from selling assets, projecting full repayment within 28 months. It was detailed, thorough, realistic. The work of someone who'd actually thought this through rather than just panicking and scrambling. This is a good start, I said carefully. But David, the money is only one part of this. The bigger question is whether you can fundamentally change how you see me and treat me. Can you stop viewing me as the mother who exists to serve your needs and start seeing me as Eleanor, a person with her own feelings and dignity and right to be treated with respect? He reached across the table and took my hand, and I let him, even though part of me wanted to pull away. I want to try, Mom. I want to be better. Not for the inheritance, not to manipulate you into changing the will, but because I genuinely miss having a real relationship with you. The kind we had when Dad was alive. The kind where I'd call you just to talk, not because I needed something. The kind where I actually cared about your day and your life and your feelings. I squeezed his hand once and then withdrew mine because I wasn't ready for sustained physical affection, not yet. Then try, I said simply. Show me through your actions, not your words. Call me weekly. Visit monthly. And not because you feel obligated, but because you actually want to. We'll see if this payment plan works. We'll see if your behavior changes. And maybe we can rebuild something real. But it's going to take time, David. Years of damage can't be repaired in weeks. He nodded and stood to leave, and at the door he turned back one more time. I'll call you tomorrow. Just to talk. No agenda. I promise. I watched him walk to his car, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but maybe the possibility of forgiveness, which was more than I'd felt in a very long time. But would his brother follow his lead? Or would James take a different path? 3 days later, on January 12th, I got my answer. James showed up at my door without calling first, and he wasn't alone. He'd brought Linda, which immediately put me on guard because Linda had been the most hostile during the New Year's confrontation. But when I opened the door, what I saw surprised me. Linda looked chastened, almost humble, her usual sharp edges softened by something that looked like genuine remorse. James was holding an envelope, and before I could say anything, he held it out to me. "This is $10,000, he said without preamble. "It's everything we could pull together right now from our savings and my year-end bonus. I'll pay the rest in installments. I already talked to my boss about taking on additional projects. And Linda sold some of her jewelry collection this week, pieces her mother gave her that she said she couldn't part with, but she did anyway because this matters more." I took the envelope but didn't open it, just held it while I studied their faces. "Why the change of heart?" I asked bluntly. "8 days ago, Linda, you called me sick for setting boundaries. You accused me of blackmailing my own children. What's different now?" Linda flinched at my words, but she didn't look away. "I was defensive," she said, and her voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. "I was panicking because I realized how much we've been using you, and admitting that would mean admitting I've been a terrible daughter-in-law. It was easier to make you the villain than to face my own behavior. But I talked to my mother about what happened, and she told me something that changed my perspective." She took a breath before continuing. "My mom said that when she was going through cancer treatment 10 years ago, you sent her care packages every week even though you barely knew her. Homemade soup, books, magazines, handwritten notes telling her she was strong and she'd beat it. You did that for 6 months while she was going through chemo. I never knew that. James never told me. And when my mom found out what we did to you at Christmas, she was furious with us. She said you'd shown her family more compassion during her illness than we'd shown you during your loneliness." She was right. I remembered those care packages. Linda's mother, Patricia, had been diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer, and I'd felt compelled to help even though we'd only met a handful of times at family events. It hadn't been a big deal to me, just some soup I was making anyway, some books I'd already read, some encouraging words that cost me nothing but a few minutes of time. But apparently, it had meant something to Patricia, enough that she remembered 10 years later and used it to teach her daughter a lesson about treating people with kindness. "Your mother is a good woman," I said simply. "She deserves support during a terrifying time. That's just basic human decency." "But that's exactly the point, Eleanor," Linda said, and there were tears in her eyes now. "You show basic human decency to near strangers, and we couldn't even show it to you, the woman who raised the man I love. I've been resentful of you for years because I felt like James could never fully be mine as long as you were in the picture. Like his loyalty to you somehow diminished his commitment to me. But that's not how love works, is it? Love isn't a finite resource that gets divided up. There's room for both a mother and a wife. I just didn't want to make room because I'm selfish and insecure, and I took those feelings out on you by encouraging James to maintain distance." James put his arm around his wife, and he looked at me with the same eyes I'd looked into when he was a newborn, red and screaming and perfect. "Linda's parents loan US $15,000 to help with the payment," he said. "They didn't have to do that. In fact, Patricia told us we didn't deserve it, but she was doing it for you, not for us. She said you deserved to be repaid for your generosity, even if it meant bailing out her irresponsible son-in-law." "That's humbling, Mom. Having your mother-in-law's parents think more highly of you than your own sons do. That's a way-up call." I invited them in, and we sat in my living room where the family photos used to hang, and we talked for 2 hours. Really talked, not the surface-level small talk that had characterized our interactions for years, but deep, honest conversation about where things had gone wrong and how they might be fixed. James admitted that he'd been using me as a backup bank, calling whenever life got hard instead of learning to manage his own finances. Linda acknowledged that she'd seen me as competition rather than family. And together, they committed to making changes, budgeting better, living within their means, including me in their lives not out of obligation, but out of genuine desire for connection. When they left, I found myself cautiously optimistic. 2 down. Both sons had shown up, admitted fault, and begun making restitution. But the real test wouldn't be these initial bursts of remorse and repayment. The real test would be whether they could sustain the change over time, whether this was genuine transformation or just a temporary performance designed to get back into my will. Only time would answer that question, and I had plenty of time to wait and watch. Over the next 6 weeks, something remarkable happened. David called every Wednesday evening at 7 p.m., and we'd talk for 30 to 45 minutes about nothing in particular: his day at work, my volunteer shifts at the shelter, a book one of us had read, a news story that caught our attention. At first, the conversations were awkward, forced, like we were strangers trying to find common ground. But gradually, they became easier, more natural, more like the relationship we'd had before life got complicated. James started coming over every other Sunday for dinner, sometimes bringing his family, sometimes coming alone. We'd cook together, experimenting with new recipes, and he'd tell me stories about his childhood that I'd forgotten, memories that made us both laugh until we cried. The money started coming in too. David's first payment of $2,000 arrived on February 1st, transferred directly to my bank account with a memo that said January installment. Thank you for your patience. James paid $1,500 on February 5th, then another lump sum of $8,000 on February 15th from selling Linda's jewelry. They were keeping their word, not just with promises, but with action, and action was the only currency that mattered anymore. But the grandchildren were the real complication, the ones who'd been caught in the crossfire of adult dysfunction. Emma, David's 14-year-old daughter, started texting me. Not long conversations, just little messages throughout the week. A funny meme, a question about homework, a photo of her school play rehearsal. Small connections that felt genuine precisely because they were small and unstaged. Tyler, James's 11-year-old son, asked if he could come over to learn how to bake cookies because his mom bought the pre-made dough from the store, and he wanted to know how to make them from scratch like Grandma did. I said yes, and we spent a Saturday afternoon measuring flour and sugar and chocolate chips, while he chattered about his soccer team and his favorite video games and all the normal things 11-year-old boys care about. These moments with my grandchildren reminded me of what I'd been fighting for all along. Not money, not revenge, but connection. Real, honest, uncomplicated connection with people who saw me as a person worth knowing, not just a resource worth exploiting. And the fact that my grandchildren were reaching out on their own, without their parents orchestrating it, suggested that maybe, just maybe, the family dynamic was actually shifting in a meaningful way. On February 28th, the deadline I'd set, both of my sons showed up at my house together. They'd clearly coordinated this visit, and they each brought envelopes. David's contained a cashier's check for $25,000. I sold my boat, he explained. The one you helped me buy 3 years ago with that $15,000 loan. It sold for $32,000, and after paying off the loan I still had on it, this is what's left. It's yours. That brings my total repayment to $27,000 so far. I'll keep paying $2,000 monthly until we're square. James handed me his envelope, which contained a check for $17,000. I took a second job, he said. Nights and weekends doing freelance consulting work. This is 2 months of earnings, combined with what Linda and I saved by cutting out restaurants and entertainment. My total repayment so far is $36,000. I'll have the rest to you within a year. I looked at these checks, these tangible representations of effort and sacrifice, and I felt something crack open inside me. Not the crack of breaking, but the crack of thawing, like ice beginning to melt after a long winter. You've both kept your word, I said, and I heard the emotion in my own voice, the vulnerability I'd been trying to keep contained. You've paid me back a significant portion of what you owed, and more than that, you've actually shown up. You've called and visited and made an effort to be present in my life. That matters more than the money. David reached for my hand. So, what happens now, Mom? With the will? With us. And there was the question, the one they'd been too afraid to ask directly, the one that hung between us like a sword suspended by a thread. I'd been thinking about this moment for weeks, preparing myself for it, and I'd made a decision. But I wasn't going to make it easy for them, because easy was what had gotten us into this mess in the first place. "The will stays as written," I said, and I watched their faces fall, watched the hope drain out of their eyes. But I wasn't finished. For now. "You've made significant progress, real progress, but 8 weeks doesn't undo years of damage. If you can maintain this level of effort, the regular calls, the monthly visits, the genuine interest in my life, for the next year, I'll reconsider. But it has to be real, David. James. It has to be because you actually value me as your mother, not because you're performing for an inheritance." James nodded slowly. "That's fair. That's more than fair. We'll keep showing up, Mom. Not for the money. For you." And maybe I was a fool for believing him, for giving them this chance after everything they'd done, but isn't that what love is? Giving people chances they probably don't deserve because you remember who they used to be and hope they can become that person again? We spent the rest of that afternoon together, the three of us, talking about memories and mistakes and the possibility of moving forward. They told me about their plans to organize a family vacation that summer, a real one that included me from the very beginning rather than as an afterthought. They showed me the reservation confirmation. They'd already booked a lake house for a week in July, big enough for everyone, paid in full. "No more Instagram surprises," David said with a sad smile. "No more secrets. If we're planning something, you're part of it." It was a small gesture in the grand scheme of things, but small gestures were how trust was rebuilt, one brick at a time until you had a foundation that could hold weight again. Spring arrived with the kind of optimism that only comes after a hard winter. The snow melted, the flowers began to bloom, and my relationship with my son slowly, carefully, tentatively began to heal. We established new patterns, healthier patterns. Sunday dinners that rotated between our houses. Wednesday evening phone calls that became a standing appointment none of us would dream of missing. Monthly outings to movies or museums or just walks in the park where we'd talk about everything and nothing. It wasn't perfect. There were still awkward moments, still flashes of resentment on my part and guilt on theirs, still days when I wondered if I was being foolish to let them back into my life after they'd hurt me so badly. But here's what I learned during those months of careful reconciliation. Forgiveness isn't a destination, it's a journey. It's not something you decide to do once and then it's done forever. It's something you choose again and again, every time the person you're forgiving gives you a reason to believe they've actually changed. And my sons were giving me those reasons, consistently, over weeks that turned into months. They weren't perfect. They still sometimes forgot to call when they said they would, or showed up late to dinners, or made plans that weren't as inclusive as they should have been. But when I pointed out these lapses, they listened. They apologized. They did better next time. And that pattern of listening and adjusting and improving, that was what convinced me they were serious. On June 1st, 4 months after the February deadline, I called my lawyer, Richard. "I want to update the will again," I told him. He laughed, not unkindly, and said, "Eleanor, I'm starting to think you should just keep me on retainer at this point. What are we changing now?" I explained that I wanted to create a new version, one that split my estate 50-50 between my sons and the animal shelter. Half of everything I'd worked for would still go to building the medical wing that would bear my name, ensuring that animals who needed help would get it. But the other half would be divided between David and James, contingent on one crucial clause. They had to maintain weekly contact with me for a minimum of 2 years before my death, or their share would revert to the shelter. "You're creating an incentive structure," Richard observed. "They maintain the relationship. They keep the inheritance. They slide back into old patterns. They lose it." I considered his words and shook my head. "It's not about incentivizing them, Richard. It's about protecting myself. If I die tomorrow, they haven't earned back their full inheritance yet. But if they keep showing up, keep being the sons I raised them to be for 2 solid years, then they've proven the change is real, and they deserve to be included in my legacy." But I need to know it's sustainable before I'm gone. I need to know they won't just revert the moment I'm not around to hold them accountable. I didn't tell my sons about this new will. I kept it as my secret, my insurance policy, my test that they didn't know they were taking. Because if they continued to show up only because they knew they might get their inheritance back, then nothing had really changed. But if they continued to show up without knowing whether it would ever matter financially, then I'd know their transformation was genuine. It was a test of character, and the best tests are the ones people don't know they're taking. The summer vacation in July was a revelation. 7 days at a lake house with my entire family, both sons, both daughters-in-law, all 4 grandchildren, and me. We cooked meals together, swam in the lake, played board games that got ridiculously competitive, and stayed up late talking on the porch while the kids chased fireflies in the yard. There were moments during that week when I looked around at my family and felt such overwhelming gratitude that tears would spring to my eyes. This was what I'd been fighting for. This was what I'd almost lost. This was what making them face consequences had ultimately given back to me. One evening, Sarah pulled me aside on that porch while everyone else was inside making popcorn for movie night. "Eleanor, I need to say something," she began, and I braced myself because conversations that start that way rarely go well. But what she said surprised me. "I was jealous of you for years. Jealous of how much David loved you, jealous of the history you two shared, jealous that he'd sometimes choose your opinion over mine. And instead of dealing with my jealousy like a mature adult, I tried to create distance between you two. I told myself I was protecting our marriage, but really, I was just being insecure and selfish. I'm sorry. Genuinely, deeply sorry. And I'm grateful you gave us a chance to make it right." I took Sarah's hand and squeezed it. "Children need grandmothers, Sarah. Husbands need mothers. There's room for both of us in David's life. There always was. I'm not trying to compete with you. I just want to be included, to be valued, to be treated with basic respect." She nodded, tears streaming down her face, and we sat there together in the warm summer evening, 2 women who'd been on opposite sides of an invisible war, finally calling a truce and beginning to build something that looked like friendship. August brought my 70th birthday, and my sons threw me a party. But not at someone's house, not at a restaurant, not in some generic venue. They threw it at the Pine Valley Animal Shelter in partnership with Martha, and they'd coordinated with the shelter to make it a fundraising event too. There were balloons and decorations and a cake shaped like a cat that made me laugh until I cried. But more than that, there were people, my book club friends, my neighbors, volunteers from the shelter, Linda's mother Patricia who'd survived cancer and remembered my care packages, and of course, my family. David gave a speech that he'd clearly written himself, not copied from the internet, about what an amazing mother I'd been and how he'd taken that for granted for too long and how grateful he was for the chance to make things right. James presented me with a photo album they'd created together, filled with pictures from our reconciliation, dinners and phone calls, and the lake house vacation, a visual timeline of healing. But the real surprise came at the end, when they announced that they'd made a joint donation to the animal shelter in my name. $5,000, split between them, earmarked for the medical wing fund. It wasn't a huge amount compared to what I was planning to leave the shelter in my will, but it was significant for them, especially given that they were still paying me back their debts. "We wanted to honor what matters to you," David explained. "These animals matter. This shelter matters. And if we're going to be part of your life, we need to be part of what you care about." I looked at my sons, these men who'd broken my heart and were now slowly, painstakingly putting it back together, and I realized something profound. They were trying. Genuinely, authentically trying. And maybe that was all anyone could ask. As fall arrived and the leaves began to change color, painting my neighborhood in shades of gold and crimson, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had started with a frozen dinner on Christmas Day and led to this moment of cautious hope. The money was almost repaid. David and James had both continued their monthly payments faithfully, and between the initial lump sums and the steady installments, They were on track to be completely square with me by next spring. But the money had never really been the point, had it? The point was teaching them that I was a person who deserved dignity. The point was making them face the consequences of their actions. The point was demanding better treatment and being willing to walk away if I didn't get it. And I had gotten it. Not perfectly, not without bumps and setbacks and moments when I wondered if I was being naive to trust them again. But overall, undeniably, things were better. My sons called regularly. They visited often. They included me in their lives not as an afterthought, but as an integral part of their family structure. The grandchildren knew they could text me anytime and I'd respond. The daughters-in-law had stopped seeing me as a threat and started seeing me as an ally. And me? I'd learned that I was strong enough to stand up for myself, brave enough to set boundaries, and wise enough to recognize genuine change when I saw it. December came around again, a full year since the Christmas that had changed everything. And on December 23rd, the anniversary of discovering that Instagram post that had shattered my illusions, my phone rang. It was David. "Mom, we're having Christmas dinner at our house this year, and you're obviously invited. But I was wondering if you'd be willing to come a day early on Christmas Eve? The kids want to do a cookie baking day, and Emma specifically requested that Grandma teach them your recipes. Sarah's going to help too, and we thought it could be a new tradition. What do you think?" I felt tears prick my eyes, but they were different tears than last year's. These were tears of joy, of healing, of hope. "I'd love that, David. I'll be there." Christmas Eve arrived, and I showed up at David's house with my car full of baking supplies, flour and sugar and chocolate chips, and all the ingredients for the recipes I'd been making for 4 decades. The kitchen was chaos in the best possible way, with Emma and Tyler and their siblings measuring ingredients incorrectly and getting flour everywhere and arguing about who got to lick the bowl. Sarah worked alongside me, asking questions about techniques and temperatures, genuinely interested in learning these recipes that connected us across generations. And David just stood in the doorway watching all of us, and when I caught his eye, he mouthed the words, "Thank you," and I knew he wasn't just thanking me for coming, but for giving him a second chance he'd almost not deserved. Christmas Day itself was everything the previous year's Christmas wasn't. We gathered at James's house for dinner. Both families, Martha from the shelter, who'd become a close friend, Dorothy, who'd supported me through the darkest days, and Patricia, who'd taught her daughter an important lesson about kindness. The table was crowded and loud and full of laughter, and when James stood up to say grace before the meal, he added something unexpected. "I'm thankful for second chances," he said, looking directly at me. "I'm thankful for a mother who loved us enough to let us face consequences, and who loved us enough to let us try again. I'm thankful we didn't lose her permanently, even though we deserved to. And I'm thankful that this year we're all together, the way family should be." We ate and laughed and told stories, and at one point, Tyler asked me if I was still leaving everything to the animal shelter. The room went quiet, everyone suddenly very interested in their dinner plates, and I knew they were all wondering the same thing, but had been too afraid to ask. I looked around that table at all these faces I loved, at the family that had broken and was now piecing itself back together, and I smiled. "I've made some changes to my will," I said carefully. "But the details are between me and my lawyer. What I will tell you is this: the animal shelter is always going to be a major beneficiary because those animals deserve help and I have the resources to provide it. But I believe in rewarding behavior that deserves rewarding. So keep showing up. Keep being present. Keep treating me like I matter. And we'll see what happens." It wasn't a guarantee. It wasn't a promise. But it was hope, and sometimes hope is the greatest gift you can give to people who are trying to change. The conversation moved on to other topics, but I caught David and James exchanging glances, and I knew they'd understood the message. The test was ongoing, but they were passing it, one day at a time, one phone call at a time, one family dinner at a time. As I drove home that night, full of good food and better memories, Whiskers meowing from his carrier in the passenger seat because I'd brought him along to James's house and he'd been thoroughly spoiled by grandchildren all day. I thought about the journey I'd been on. A year ago, I'd been alone and heartbroken, spending Christmas with a frozen dinner and wondering where I'd gone wrong as a mother. Now I was full and happy, surrounded by a family that was imperfect but trying, healing but not healed, better but not perfect. And I realized that perfect had never been the goal. The goal was real. The goal was honest. The goal was a family dynamic built on respect rather than obligation, on genuine connection rather than guilt and manipulation. I'd set my boundaries. I'd demanded better treatment. I'd been willing to walk away if necessary. And because I'd done all those hard things, because I'd loved myself enough to say enough is enough, I'd gotten back something I thought I'd lost forever, a relationship with my sons that felt authentic. They hadn't just learned to treat me better out of fear of losing their inheritance. They'd learned to see me as a person, as Eleanor, as someone whose feelings mattered and whose life had value beyond what I could give them. And that transformation, that fundamental shift in how they viewed me, was worth more than all the money in my estate. So here's what I want you to take away from my story. Setting boundaries isn't cruel. Demanding respect isn't selfish. Walking away from people who treat you poorly isn't giving up on them. Sometimes it's the wake-up call they need to actually change. I could have spent the rest of my life accepting crumbs, being grateful for whatever attention my sons chose to give me, pretending that their neglect and lies didn't hurt as long as we maintained the illusion of family harmony. But I didn't. I chose myself. I chose my dignity. I chose to teach them that love without respect is worthless. And yes, there was a risk. There was a very real possibility that they'd choose their resentment over reconciliation, that they'd refuse to pay me back or make any effort to repair our relationship, that I'd end up alone anyway, but with the added bitterness of a family permanently fractured. But here's what I've learned. Being alone because you stood up for yourself is infinitely better than being surrounded by people who make you feel alone. And sometimes, the only way to find out if people genuinely love you is to stop making it easy for them, to stop accepting bare minimum effort, to stop being the one who always gives while they always take. My sons could have failed this test. They could have written me off as a crazy old woman, fought the debt collection in court, contested my will, and moved on with their lives without me. But they didn't. They chose the hard road of self-examination and behavior change. They chose to face what they'd done and try to make it right. And that choice, that decision to do the work of becoming better men, better sons, better human beings, that's what earned them a second chance. Not their initial apologies, not their tearful confessions, but their sustained effort over months and months to actually be different. Now, I want to hear from you because this isn't just my story. It's a story that probably resonates with your own life in ways that might be uncomfortable to admit. Have you been in my position, treated as an ATM by family members who take and take without giving back? Have you been spending holidays alone while the people who are supposed to love you most are making memories without you? Have you been accepting disrespect and calling it peace, tolerating neglect and calling it family? If so, I want you to do something for me right now. I want you to leave a comment below and tell me, what boundary do you need to set? What line do you need to draw? What relationship in your life would change if you finally demanded the respect you deserve? And here's the second thing I want you to do. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, because this channel is dedicated to stories like mine, stories about people who got tired of being doormats and decided to stand up for themselves. Stories about revenge that's really just justice. Stories about betrayal that leads to transformation. These stories matter because they remind us that we're not alone in our struggles, that other people have faced similar situations and survived them, that there's a way forward even when it feels like we're trapped in impossible circumstances. Finally, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. You know who I'm talking about. That friend who keeps making excuses for family members who treat them terribly, that coworker who's always bailing out irresponsible relatives, that person in your life who needs permission to put themselves first for once. Send them this video and tell them Eleanor says they deserve better. Because we all deserve better. We all deserve to be treated with basic human dignity by the people who claim to love us. And if we're not getting that treatment, we have every right to demand it or walk away. So leave that comment. Tell me your story. Tell me what boundary you're going to set. And know that wherever you are right now, whatever family dysfunction you're dealing with, you're not alone. There's a whole community of us who've been where you are, who've made the hard choices, who've survived the fallout and come out stronger on the other side. We're here. We're listening. And we're cheering you on as you find the courage to demand the respect and love you deserve. Now go set those boundaries and reclaim your life. Thank you for listening to my story. And thank you for being here.